This is discussion 6A, although it's actually the only part of discussion 6. I want to give you a preview of the Bhagavad Gita because you're starting to read that now. And I know that it can be kind of confusing. It's kind of like, what the heck's going on here? So I want to sort of lay out the story so that you can understand what you're looking at. But I also want to give you some questions, some things to think about as you're reading it. Okay, so basically the Bhagavad Gita. The Bhagavad Gita is actually a part of a much larger, like thousands-page work called the Mahabharata. And this was written over several centuries in roughly, about 800 BCE. And the central idea of the Mahabharata is that there is this war going on between two cousins. There basically is a war over a kingdom between two factions led by two cousins. And we know the war took place somewhere between 1000 to 700 BCE. In fact, we have the city of Dvaraka is mentioned in the Mahabharata, and excavations there have shown that there really was war. Buildings burned down, city burned down at this time period. So it seems to be based roughly on real life events, but it's a work of literature, right? It's got all sorts of different plots and characters and all sorts of things going on, and it's an epic story with all sorts of subplots, and it's really complicated. So the Bhagavad Gita is just one small part of this larger epic, okay? In the Bhagavad Gita itself, there's two characters, basically. The whole story is a conversation between two characters. Actually, there's a little bit at the beginning where a blind king is asking somebody to describe what he sees, but then what he starts describing is this conversation between two characters. There's a prince named Arjuna, and Arjuna is lined up in a battle. He's going to go to battle, and there are two armies facing each other, thousands and thousands of people on each side, and Arjuna, he's in a chariot, and he's going to go out in the chariot to the space between the two armies. He's going to look over the two armies and see what's going on before the battle starts. And he goes out there, and he looks, and he sees that on the other side, he's got a whole bunch of cousins, right? He's got not aunts, but uncles and cousins over there, people he knows that he might have to kill. And he suddenly has a crisis of conscience, like, oh my gosh, maybe I shouldn't fight. I shouldn't be killing my own family. Maybe I shouldn't fight. And then his chariot driver, he's got a servant who's been sort of driving the chariot, turns around and suddenly reveals himself to be the god Krishna. Now, this is a common thing in Indian religious writings, that the gods, there are lots of gods. Brahman is the sort of universal life force, the god of everything. But then there are other gods who are what's called avatars, or manifestations of Brahman. The three main ones are Shiva and Krishna and Vishnu. Shiva and Deva and Vishnu. And then each of those has avatars who are manifestations of that, and Krishna is one of these. So the basic idea is that gods can take on human characteristics and go down to earth and be human and sort of interact with humans and see what's going on. And so Arjuna's chariot driver turns around and suddenly reveals himself to be the god Krishna. And so Arjuna says, well, geez, Krishna, should I fight or should I not fight? And so the rest of the story is basically Arjuna asking questions and Krishna giving answers, right? And so Krishna explains how the universe works, and he explains in the end why Arjuna should, in fact, fight, even if he's going to kill his relatives. And so there are several key ideas here that come out of what Krishna says. The first is the whole story is built around the caste system. Now, I talked in a previous lecture about India about this caste system. There were basically 5 castes, although the lowest one isn't called a caste. At the top, you have the Brahmins, who are priests. They're the priestly caste. And then you have the Kshatriyas, who are the warriors and government bureaucrats, and etc. And then below that, you have the Vaishyas, who are the merchants. And then below that, you have the Shudras, who are the peasants, the farmers. And then below that, you have the untouchables, who aren't actually a caste. And the untouchables often do jobs like burying dead bodies or making leather or things that are considered to be unclean. And we'll talk more about the caste system when we get to the lectures about India on Monday. But for right now, I just want to say that the caste system is central here, because Krishna's answer to Arjuna is basically, you're a Kshatriya, and that means you're a warrior, and so your caste is supposed to fight. That's your duty, is to fight, right? So he's basically saying every caste has to do its duty. The gods actually require that the caste do its duty. Okay? Now, this is connected to a much larger idea. And I mentioned this briefly when I was talking about the Upanishads in a previous lecture in India. But beginning about 800, you start to see some new ideas percolating up in Indian society, and they come together in this collection of texts called the Upanishads. And one of the central ideas here is the idea that each person's soul is reborn over and over again. So when you die, your soul moves into a new body and you're born again as another person. Or in fact, there are variations. You could even be born as an animal. And this cycle of life, death, rebirth is called samsara. And so this cycle of life and death, rebirth is, Krishna connects that to the caste system, right? He basically says, when you die, the way you lived your life determines where you're coming back in the next life. If you lived your life really well, you'll come back in a better life. If you lived your life badly, you'll come back in a worse life. This is karma. All right. Now, being reborn again and again and again is painful, right? Life is full of suffering, and so having to live life over and over again it kind of sucks. So the goal of every soul is not to be born again. But the only way you can do that, the only way you can really avoid not be born again is by enlightenment. Okay? The whole purpose of life is to teach each soul enlightenment. Once you gain enlightenment and you realize the absolute interconnectedness of everything, that we are all one, then you will not be born again. Your soul will basically go and join Brahman, which means it's sort of a version of heaven. And it won't have to be born again and again. And so essentially what Krishna is doing is he's saying, you're born over and over again, and you want to get to moksha. To get to moksha, you need enlightenment. And enlightenment means you have to learn how the universe works. And the way you do that, Krishna says, is you perform the duties of your caste exactly. You do what you're supposed to do for your caste. And for Arjuna, he's a kshatriya. That means you fight. And Krishna throws out the nice little bone. He says, look, you kill your cousin, he's just going to come back in another body. If he's lived a good life, he'll come back better. Right? So no problem. And so Krishna is connecting this larger philosophy about samsara and moksha and rebirth and enlightenment to the caste system. Okay? So when you're reading this, I want you to be thinking about how, what are the effects of the Bhagavad Gita? Because we're historians here. We're trying to figure out how did this shape. We're not going to try to figure out if this is actually true and this is what happens to your soul after you die, because historians don't deal with the metaphysical or the afterlife or anything like that. We only deal with what we can find in human history. So instead, what we're going to ask about the Bhagavad Gita is, what impact did this story have on Indian society, and what does this tell us about Indian society, right? Because this document, it was meant to enlighten people and help them to achieve moksha, but for our purposes, it can help enlighten us as to how people in ancient India thought about life, death, the caste system, etc. At least we'll get the official version, right? Because the Bhagavad Gita is basically the official version, the perfect version of how this is supposed to work, right? So while we're looking at this, I want you to be thinking about some things. Number one is, why would people buy into the caste system? Why would untouchables or why would Shudras say, yeah, the caste system is great? What does the Bhagavad Gita offer them, right? Second, I want you to think about, how is this going to stabilize society, right? Because essentially, this is part of the Bhagavad Gita is one of the major texts in Hinduism, and we'll get into Hinduism. But Hinduism is the sort of the dominant ideology or the dominant religion of a lot of Indian governments and Indian society. So how does this stabilize society, right? And in fact, we'll actually see that Hinduism stabilizes Indian society without even being connected to governments often. It simply creates a more stable society because people believe it. How does it do that? What's the mechanism for that, right? And then I want you to think about what sort of behaviors does the Bhagavad Gita encourage, right? Because the Bhagavad Gita actually has some fairly explicit ideas about caste systems and about the people who are in certain castes and about how people should behave and what's moral behavior and what's not moral behavior, right? So I want you to be thinking about that as you're reading this and be thinking, well, how does this shape people's behaviors, and how is this going to produce a stable society? So think about those questions as you read the Bhagavad Gita. If you have questions along the way, I'm happy to answer them via the Q&A or via email or the discussion forum on the class website. And I'll be talking more about the Bhagavad Gita in a later discussion right before you have to do your second reading response, which is on the Bhagavad Gita.